History books won't tell you this, but humanity has declared war over buckets, pigs, seashells, and even badly behaved poodles. Forget epic battles and noble causes. Today, you're getting the dumbest, weirdest, and most brain-meltingly absurd wars in human history. Real conflicts. Real deaths. Absolutely ridiculous reasons. From emperors fighting oceans to countries beefing over pastries. This is not a parody. It's history at its most unhinged. Let's begin. 1. All right, let's start with one of the most wholesome military operations in history. In 1866, tiny Liechtenstein decided to take part in the Austro-Prussian War. Their entire army, all 80 men, marched off to defend an alpine pass that no one actually tried to take. They saw zero combat, enjoyed what we can only assume was a beautiful taxpayer-funded camping trip, and then returned home. But here's the twist. They came back with 81 soldiers. Yep, somehow they picked up a new guy along the way, like a bonus human. No battles, no bloodshed, just a mysterious friend and a great story. Liechtenstein may be the only country in history to end a war with more troops than it started with. That's not a defeat or a victory, that's a recruiting miracle. 2. Ancient Rome, around 40 AD, gave us many strange things, but none quite like Emperor Caligula's war on the sea. The story goes that Caligula, offended by the sea god Neptune, or maybe just having a very bad day, ordered his legions to attack the ocean. And they did. Thousands of armored soldiers marched to the beach and, under imperial orders, began stabbing waves, as in literal water. After this salty display of might, Caligula declared victory and had them collect seashells as trophies of conquest. That's right, seashells. Imagine being a Roman soldier, trying to look brave while sword-fighting the tide. It's less military campaign and more very expensive group therapy session. Rome, where even the water wasn't safe. 3. In 1325, two powerful Italian city-states, Bologna and Modena, got into a deadly conflict over a wooden bucket. No, not metaphorically, a literal, physical bucket. The Modenese allegedly stole it from a Bolognese well, and Bologna, deeply insulted, demanded it back. Modena refused, with the medieval equivalent of finders keepers. What followed was the Battle of Zappolino, a real, bloody clash that killed thousands, over a bucket, a container, for water. And here's the kicker, that exact bucket is still on display in Modena, like a war trophy from history's pettiest conflict. It's a reminder that sometimes pride weighs more than logic, and that medieval Italians were absolutely ready to die for their Tupperware. 4. Let's head to 1859 and the picturesque San Juan Islands, a place so lovely it was claimed by both the USA and Britain. There, a man named Lyman Cutlar owned a potato patch. And into that patch wandered a British-owned pig. After a few too many root veg feasts, Cutlar snapped and shot the pig. And that's how an international crisis began. Both sides mobilized troops. Warships were readied. Diplomats panicked over a pig, one single porker. The world briefly hovered on the edge of a ham-fueled war. Fortunately, the only casualty remained the pig, and a group of Germans helped mediate peace. But for a moment, the fate of the Pacific Northwest balanced on the bacon-covered back of one very unlucky farm animal. That's one way to hog the headlines. 5. Now we head to the Greek-Bulgarian border in 1925 for what may be the world's most dramatic game of fetch. A Greek soldier was out walking his dog near the frontier when the pooch suddenly bolted across into Bulgarian territory. The soldier gave chase but was tragically shot by Bulgarian guards. Greece, understandably furious, issued a firm ultimatum. And when that failed, launched a military incursion. That's right, a war over a dog. It became known as the War of the Stray Dog because history has a sense of humor. The League of Nations had to step in and defuse the situation, likely while asking both sides, "Are you serious right now?" No one knows what happened to the dog, but it's safe to say it started one of the furriest diplomatic meltdowns of the 20th century. 6. In 1839, Missouri and the Iowa Territory nearly went to war over something Winnie the Pooh would absolutely support: honey. A strip of land rich in honey-producing trees was claimed by both sides. Missouri tried taxing residents there. Iowa said, "Not your bees, not your trees." And tensions escalated. Both sides actually called up their militias. Yes, armed men mobilized over syrup. For a few tense weeks, rifles and tempers were primed. Fortunately, no shots were fired, and the U.S. Supreme Court eventually stepped in with the legal equivalent of a spray bottle. But for a sweet moment in American history, it seemed war could break out not over oil, land, or politics, but because two territories really wanted the same sticky breakfast topping. 7. Now we're in Mexico City, 1838. A French pastry chef named Monsieur Remontel claimed that Mexican officers had ransacked his bakery years earlier, destroying his precious baked goods. He demanded 60,000 pesos in damages, an absurd sum even for a very fancy eclair. At first, Mexico laughed him off. Then France got involved. And by got involved, I mean they sent an entire naval fleet, blockaded ports, and shelled a fortress. Yes, this was a war fought, literally, over pastries. Diplomats could have settled it with a croissant and coffee. Instead, cannons fired, soldiers fought. The Pastry War became a very real thing. Just imagine explaining to your kids that your ship sank because of an international dispute over ruined tarts. Bon appétit, diplomacy. 8. Our next absurdity comes from 1739, in what became known as the War of Jenkins Ear. 8 years earlier, Spanish Coast Guards boarded a British merchant ship and allegedly sliced off the captain's ear, a man named Robert Jenkins. They told him to take it to his king as a message, and he did. 7 years later, Jenkins walked into the British Parliament, pulled out his ear, which he had kept preserved in a jar, and told his story. Parliament, already itching for a fight with Spain, used the ear as an excuse to declare war. A full-scale military conflict, all apparently sparked by one chunk of cartilage. No one can say whether the ear was still fresh, but one thing's certain: Britain knew how to hold a grudge. With formaldehyde. 9. Back to the 18th century we go, where Austria fought Austria. In 1788, during a campaign against the Ottomans, the Austrian army set up camp near Sebes. That night, a group of soldiers went looking for booze and found some locals selling schnapps. Soon they were drunk, loud, and heavily armed. A misfire caused panic. Others thought the Ottomans were attacking, and in the darkness, chaos erupted. Entire regiments fired on each other, blindly. Horses fled. Officers shouted in 5 different languages, and by morning, hundreds were dead, killed entirely by friendly fire. The actual Ottoman army arrived 2 days later to find a battlefield already covered in bodies. Austria had fought and defeated itself. Sometimes the enemy is within, literally. 10. Now we're back in America for the Aroostook War, also affectionately known as the Pork and Beans War. It was 1838, and the U.S. state of Maine and British-controlled New Brunswick couldn't agree on where the border was. So what did they do? Sent in lumberjacks. Not diplomats. Not soldiers. Axe-wielding men in flannel. When tensions escalated, both sides called in militias. Forts were built. Supplies stockpiled. Yet not a single shot was fired. The whole war involved angry telegrams, a few arrests, and a lot of bean-based meals. Eventually, the Webster-Ashburton Treaty drew a nice, peaceful line on the map. But for a while, international conflict loomed over bacon, beans, and birch trees. History's coziest almost war. 11. It's 1900, and in what is today Ghana, the British Empire decided to do what it did best: demand to sit on something sacred. The Ashanti people possessed the Golden Stool, a revered symbol of their nation and spiritual authority. The British governor, in a dazzling display of colonial ignorance, requested to sit on it. This was not just a chair. It was believed to contain the soul of the Ashanti people. Unsurprisingly, the Ashanti did not take this well. They rose up, and the conflict became known as the War of the Golden Stool. The British eventually retreated, tail between legs, and the stool was hidden away for safekeeping. Let that be a lesson: not every seat is for sitting, especially ones that literally hold someone's soul. 12. Now let's talk about the Whiskey War, a decades-long standoff between Canada and Denmark over an uninhabited rock called Hans Island. No one lived there. There were no resources. It was just a lump of Arctic stone, but both countries wanted it. So whenever one side visited, they'd remove the other's flag, plant their own, and leave behind a bottle of booze, Canadian whiskey or Danish schnapps. This peaceful game of capture the flag, leave a drink went on for almost 50 years. No one got hurt. No shots were fired. Just two nations politely trolling each other with alcohol. In 2022, they finally agreed to split the island. Possibly the most civilized war in human history. Cheers to that. 13. Time to get sticky. In 1839, Missouri and the Iowa Territory nearly came to blows over a patch of land rich in honey-producing trees. Missouri claimed it, sent in tax collectors. Locals said no, Iowa said hell no, and militias were mobilized. Armed men lined up near the border, ready to fight for control over some bees. The best part? Someone actually cut down trees to steal the honey, escalating the whole mess. Newspapers ran wild with buzz-related puns. Cooler heads finally prevailed, and the U.S. Supreme Court drew a boundary line. But for a sweet minute there, Americans were ready to go to war over nectar. It's probably the only time in history when the phrase, "too sweet to handle," became a military concern. 14. 1866. Again, but now we visit Liechtenstein's more famous neighbor, the Kingdom of Italy. They didn't send 80 guys camping. No, Italy was busy fighting over Sardinia with itself. For centuries, two proud maritime republics, Pisa and Genoa, couldn't decide who should own the island. They launched fleets, sacked ports, battled on land and sea, over and over. The island changed hands more often than a cursed coin. Sometimes Pisa had it, sometimes Genoa, sometimes nobody. One source even claimed they tried to steal each other's churches, brick by brick, just to prove a point. The Sardinians? They mostly watched, unimpressed. A war of pride, stubbornness, and mutual pettiness, Mediterranean style. 15. Jump to 1883, Kansas, Dodge City, to be exact. America's Wild West was already chaotic, but the Dodge City War took things to the next level of ridiculous. It wasn't a war of armies, but of gamblers, saloon owners, and lawmen with competing interests. One side had Bat Masterson and Wyatt Earp, real Wild West legends. The other had the local mayor and his loyal enforcers. There were standoffs, arrests, legal shenanigans, and dramatic posturing, but nobody actually shot anyone. Eventually, the governor stepped in and said, "Enough cowboy cosplay," and restored order. The entire thing was less about law and more about who got to control the town's booze and poker tables. Peak Western capitalism. 16. It's the late 1800s, and two American paleontologists, Othniel Charles Marsh and Edward Drinker Cope, are about to wage war. Not with guns, but with shovels, egos, and sabotage. This was the Bone Wars. These two men hated each other so much, they destroyed fossils to keep them from each other. They bribed diggers, published fake accusations, and even named dinosaur species just to mock one another. The rivalry pushed dinosaur science forward by decades, but also wrecked countless valuable specimens. Imagine funding expeditions just to blow up your enemy's discoveries. It was part science, part petty soap opera, Jurassic pettiness, funded by the Smithsonian. And yes, it was every bit as dramatic as it sounds. 17. Let's travel to 1986, straight into the Chadian desert for the Toledo War. A name that sounds like a boardroom argument, but was very real. Chad, a vastly under-equipped nation, was facing off against Libya's heavily armored army. You'd expect tanks versus tanks. But Chad had a better idea. Modified Toyota pickup trucks. Fast, cheap, and surprisingly effective. They slapped anti-tank weapons onto the beds and used their mobility to run circles around the slower Libyan forces. And it worked. They absolutely wrecked Libyan armored divisions, flipping the script on what lightly armed really means. It's probably the only modern conflict where a car brand deserves a medal. Never underestimate a Hilux with attitude. 18. Let's meet one of history's most lovable oddballs, Emperor Norton the Fierce, self-declared Emperor of the United States and Protector of Mexico. In the 1860s, Joshua Norton was a San Francisco eccentric who just decided he was in charge. The public loved him. Businesses honored his fake currency, police saluted him. And among his many royal decrees, he declared war on Congress for being too corrupt. No one listened, of course, but he also declared peace immediately after, so it balanced out. He even demanded a bridge be built between San Francisco and Oakland, which would eventually happen. Delusional? Maybe. But in a world of chaos, Emperor Norton was oddly consistent. He ruled without violence, taxes, or logic, and people adored him for it. 19. Now for a conflict that started with breadfruit. In the late 18th century, the British Empire had a plan. Ship breadfruit plants from Tahiti to the Caribbean to feed enslaved laborers cheaply. Enter the HMS Bounty and its infamous mutiny. But here's the twist. The sailors weren't mad about the mission itself. They were mad about how much space the plants took up. Water, food, and comfort were sacrificed for the trees. Tempers boiled, and eventually, so did the chain of command. The crew mutinied, set Captain Bligh adrift, and took the bounty back to the South Pacific. So yes, a mutiny, and near-imperial collapse, triggered by a leafy carbohydrate. Breadfruit, nature's quiet revolutionary. 20. It's 1212, and a crowd of thousands of children in France and Germany decide they're going to reclaim Jerusalem, without weapons, armies, or food, just divine belief. This was the Children's Crusade, a tragic mix of mass delusion, religious fervor, and adult irresponsibility. Most of the children never made it past southern Europe. Many starved. Some died from disease. Others were sold into slavery. The few that survived returned home years later, if at all. And no, they never even saw the Holy Land. It remains one of history's most heartbreaking examples of how bad ideas, when mixed with faith and desperation, can end in disaster. Crusade? More like collective child endangerment, medieval edition. 21. In the late 1500s, Cologne got dragged into war over something simple and scandalous: marriage. The Archbishop of Cologne, one of the 7 electors of the Holy Roman Empire, decided to convert to Protestantism and, gasp, get married. This was not okay with Catholic powers, because apparently religious reform is bad, but a bishop finding love? That's unforgivable. Cue full-blown war. Armies marched, cities burned. All because one holy man chose a wife over celibacy and Rome got petty about it. It's probably the only time in history where the phrase shotgun wedding applies to an entire region. Moral of the story: never underestimate how far organized religion will go to block someone's honeymoon. 22. In the early 20th century, somewhere in upper-class Germany, 2 aristocratic women got into a heated feud. Over what? Their poodles. One accused the other's dog of improper behavior in public, probably sniffing where it shouldn't. The situation escalated so wildly that their husbands almost dueled over it. That's right, grown men, armed, prepared to risk death to defend their dog's honor. Newspapers picked it up. Society followed the saga like it was a soap opera. In the end, cooler heads, and maybe the poodles themselves, diffused the tension. But for a brief, glorious moment, Germany stood at the brink of the Poodle War. Proof that high society is not immune to low-stakes madness. 23. Let's talk about something truly stupid. In 1778, during the American Revolution, patriots came up with a clever plan to destroy British ships docked in Philadelphia. The plan? Fill barrels with gunpowder, float them downriver, and hope they explode on impact. They called it the Battle of the Kegs. Sadly, the kegs mostly floated around aimlessly. Some exploded, most didn't. British soldiers panicked and began firing cannons at barrels, terrified of being outsmarted by floating beer traps. No ships were destroyed, but the Americans did win something better: PR. They turned it into a song. So while it failed militarily, it succeeded in annoying the enemy and entertaining the masses. Explosive disappointment never sounded so catchy. 24. And now, Sardinia. From the 11th to 13th centuries, Pisa and Genoa fought a ridiculously long and bloody war over control of this island. Why? Because both sides were obsessed with dominating the Tyrrhenian Sea. What began as a rivalry of merchants and sailors became a full-on obsession. They built fleets, sacked each other's ports, and traded the island back and forth like a cursed souvenir. At one point, Genoa even kidnapped a Sardinian bishop just to prove a point. This wasn't about territory. It was about pride, stubbornness, and maritime ego. Centuries later, Sardinians would probably still agree. The only thing dumber than losing your island is losing it twice in 1 century. Well played, Italy. 25. In 1835, the USA had a domestic showdown that almost became an actual war between Ohio and the Michigan Territory. The reason? A thin strip of swampy land called the Toledo Strip. Both sides claimed it, and neither was willing to back down. Militias were mobilized, troops stood off, and for a few tense weeks, the country stared down the barrel of civil absurdity. Shots were fired, into the air. One man got stabbed, by accident. The rest was just shouting and paperwork. Eventually, the federal government gave Toledo to Ohio and threw Michigan a consolation prize, the Upper Peninsula. Because what says, "Sorry, we took your mud," like miles of frozen forest? It was American conflict resolution at its pettiest. 26. Iceland versus the United Kingdom. No, not in Eurovision, but in the North Atlantic, over fish. From the 1950s to the 1970s, the Cod Wars raged as Iceland extended its fishing limits and the UK refused to recognize them. British trawlers kept fishing, Icelandic patrol boats tried to stop them, and what followed was a decade-long battle of net-cutting, ship-ramming, and diplomatic fish-slapping. No one officially declared war, but nerves were shredded and hulls were dented. Eventually, Iceland got its way, and exclusive fishing rights. It might be the only conflict in history where victory was measured in tons of haddock. Tense, ridiculous, and incredibly fishy. 27. In 1969, tensions between El Salvador and Honduras exploded, and a soccer game was the spark. During World Cup qualifiers, violence broke out among fans, fueled by long-standing political and immigration issues. When El Salvador lost, riots erupted. Days later, the Salvadoran army crossed the border. A real war with airstrikes and casualties, all triggered by a football match. The fighting lasted 100 hours before a ceasefire. Both sides claimed victory, but no one really won. Except maybe FIFA, which now uses this story to explain why they take stadium security so seriously. The football war remains a cautionary tale. Never underestimate how far people will go for revenge in cleats. 28. In 1961, the CIA tried to overthrow Fidel Castro in Cuba by sending a group of Cuban exiles to invade. It was called the Bay of Pigs invasion, and it went about as well as a mission planned by a committee of overconfident amateurs. Bad intel, botched landings, and a complete underestimation of Cuban forces led to disaster. The exiles were captured. The operation was exposed, and the USA got an international black eye so big it could have starred in its own soap opera. It was supposed to be a swift victory. Instead, it became the textbook example of how not to do a coup. If military history were a blooper reel, this would be the opener and the encore. 29. Now we travel back to the 15th century, to France, where nobles had an excellent idea. Let's all rise up in a totally incoherent rebellion. This mess became known as the Mad War, La Guerre Folle, and it lived up to the name. Powerful aristocrats challenged the regency of Anne of Beaujeu, then got distracted by infighting, alliances that lasted 5 minutes, and plots that made absolutely no sense. At one point, they switched sides mid-war. The crown crushed the rebellion, mostly because the rebels spent more time backstabbing each other than actually fighting. It was like Game of Thrones if the writers had replaced dragons with drunken in-laws and forgotten the plot halfway through. Medieval chaos at its finest. 30. In 1667, Louis XIV of France invaded the Spanish Netherlands. And his excuse? a bizarre inheritance law called devolution, which basically said his wife deserved the territory because her dad died. It was a legal technicality no one outside of 5 dusty scholars cared about. But Louis thought it sounded official enough, so he sent the army. What followed was the War of Devolution, a short, relatively tame conflict, but one born entirely from royal ego and some medieval fine print. It's like declaring war because of a confusing will clause. France flexed, Spain fumed, and Europe sighed. Turns out, "My wife deserves it" has been a terrible argument long before internet arguments existed. 31. Back in the 13th century, the War of St. Sabas broke out between 2 superpower city-states, Venice and Genoa, over control of one single monastery in the Holy Land. Just one. Not even a fortress. A monastery. Both sides claimed it, neither blinked, and soon their rivalry spiraled into a brutal 14-year naval conflict. Fleets were sunk, trade routes disrupted, and countless lives lost. All for the right to maintain a few walls, some monks, and a rooftop view of Acre. It's arguably the most expensive property dispute in medieval history. Zillow would list it as spiritual vibe, minor bloodshed potential. Genoa eventually won. But looking back, everyone lost, especially the monks. 32. In 1983, a tiny Spanish village called Lijar declared war on France. The reason, French citizens in Paris had allegedly insulted the visiting Spanish king. Outraged, Lijar's mayor convened the town council and, with all 300 residents behind him, officially declared hostilities. France never noticed. No soldiers were sent. No shots were fired. For over 100 years, the war remained active, entirely on paper. Finally, in 1983, Lijar formally declared peace. They hadn't done anything aggressive, but they had made a point. It's probably the only war in history fought with 0 weapons and 100% pride. Diplomacy by dramatic gesture. Small town edition. 33. And we end with the shortest war ever recorded. The Anglo-Zanzibar War of 1896. After the death of the Sultan, the British wanted their preferred candidate in charge. Zanzibar disagreed and fortified the palace. The Brits issued an ultimatum, got ignored, and at 9:02 a.m. opened fire. By 9:40, it was over. 40 minutes. One side lost their entire navy, 1 boat. The palace was flattened, and the new sultan surrendered immediately. The war ended before most people even finished breakfast. It remains the Guinness World Record holder for briefest armed conflict. Imagine going to war, losing everything, and still being done in time for brunch. History's fastest L. So there you have it. 33 wars that make you question how our species ever made it past the Bronze Age. And now it's your turn. Which one was the most ridiculous? Or better, can you name a war that's even dumber than these 33? Drop it in the comments, and if it's wild enough, we just might feature it in the next episode. If this made you laugh, squint, or yell, "What?" at your screen, you know what to do. Smash that like, hit subscribe, and let's rewrite history, one absurdity at a time.